Welcome back. We're going to start today, before we get into our discussion of land art, we're going to start with a little self-quiz. You don't need to turn this in, but just look at the following images and name the movements which they represent. I'll give you a couple seconds before I tell you what it is, so if you want more time, you can always press pause. This is an example from Abstract Expressionism, or specifically color field painting, by Mark Rothko. This is an example of minimalism, a piece by Donald Judd. This is a piece of pop art by Roy Lichtenstein. This is a piece that represents abstract expressionism by artist Willem de Kooning from 1950. This is a piece by Eva Hesse, technically post-minimalism, although if you thought minimalism strictly, that's okay as well. She definitely uses that same similar industrial material and pared down form, but with a little more of an organic nature that makes it post-minimalism. Hopefully you recognize this one as pop art, this piece by Richard Hamilton from 1956. And this would be an example of minimalism, a piece by Don Flavin. Okay, so hopefully many of those pieces were recognizable. If not, consider printing some images out, maybe hanging them on a wall so that you can see them even in passing and start associating their names and some of their characteristics with the pieces. All right, in this discussion we're looking at land art, and another word for that could be earthworks or environmental art. These are pieces that usually take place outdoors in the environment and most often make use of natural materials. One of the quintessential pieces of land art would be this image by Robert Smithson called the Spiral Jetty from 1970. And here, this is created out in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, where he had rock bulldozed into this arrangement, into this spiral form out in the Great Salt Lake. It's approximately 15 feet wide, so several people could walk side by side out into this spiral. And it does interact with the environment. It will wear away with time. It will be covered by snow or ice. Sometimes it's completely covered by the water in a high water season, so that you can't see it at all, and then it will reappear. And at certain seasons, there's even a kind of a reddish color to the water because of certain algae that grow inside of the spiral where the current doesn't clean the water out as well. So kind of an interesting color interchange that happens depending on the season and the chemistry of the water. Smithson was drawing on other natural forms, spirals in shells and in our understanding of galaxies and the universe. And the idea of the golden spiral that goes back to ancient Greece as a very beautiful and almost a perfect ratio. He was also interested in the idea of entropy, which is a degradation of the matter and energy in the universe to an ultimate state of inert uniformity, or a process of degradation or running down of a trend toward disorder. So rather than the artworks of old that sought to be universal and everlasting, infinite, he makes this work knowing that it will run down, knowing that it will be overtaken by nature. And I think he believed in the idea that humans are just a part of nature like everything else. And that rather than trying to fight time and fight death, you could say, that we should be a part of this sense of everything going back to its ultimate state, right? Going back toward disorder. In certain seasons, you can walk out on the spiral jetty, and you can notice here in this close-up the salt composites, or the salt accumulating on the edges of the rock here, and how it interacts there. Robert Smithson was very well-spoken and very theoretically oriented, so he did quite a lot of writing. Just a few notes from him about noting some of his influences. He noted the influence of minimalist artists such as Flavin, Judd, LeWitt, and Tony Smith. And this will be evident in the work of a lot of land artists, that they often have a minimalist aesthetic. And so they'll take or make use of simplified forms or repetition of forms in a similar way to the minimalists. A rejecting of abstract painters such as de Kooning or Rauschenberg and their anthropomorphism or formalism. And he was to say that I was interested in this kind of archetypal gut situation that was based on primordial needs and the unconscious depths. So if you think about how removed many of us are from the natural world, we live in air-conditioned spaces and work in air-conditioned buildings, and and we buy our food from grocery stores where we never actually see the actual chicken or the dirt of the farm from where the carrots were grown. We live in a very distanced world, most of us. And I think in a certain way, the land artist, and Smithson certainly in particular, was interested in trying to get back to that contact, that primordial contact between humans and their environment. He also is interested in an account by minimalist artist Tony Smith, who told about an experience of driving on an unfinished section of the New Jersey Turnpike. That seems like a very unlikely source of inspiration, but this is what Tony Smith said about it. He said, "This drive, it couldn't be called a work of art. On the other hand, it did something for me that art had never done. It seemed that there had been a reality there that had not had any expression in art." And that reality, he was on this part of the turnpike and had this very visceral experience, this sense of being immersed in three-dimensional space surrounding him. And a lot of the artists at this time are thinking, well, you can paint a landscape, but no matter how big the painting is, it never fully immerses you. It's always still this flat illusion of space, but it never actually swallows you up or gives you this whole bodily experience. And so they wanted to take the viewer out of the gallery, out of the museum, and actually surround you in an environment, or surround you with these natural forms. Smithson also notes the impact of modern literature, such as Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, Eliot, and Pound, as well as travel across America and Europe. And he says, well, out of the defunct class culture of Europe, I developed something that was intrinsically my own and rooted to my own experience in America. If we think about the history of the U.S. coming out of European tradition hundreds of years ago, there is this idea of America as this, this pioneering place of heading west, and there being this new land, this new terrain to experience. We are a very large country compared to the close proximity and small scale of many of the European countries. And so there is something unique and kind of inherently American in that sense about going out into the landscape and sort of pioneering a new form of art outdoors on this new land. But of course, there's a problem with land art, right? You can't bring it into the museum or the gallery. So how are you going to get people to actually see the work? And how do you engage in the dialogue that happens as a part of the art world in the galleries and museums? Well, Smithson, for one, among others, would do some of his work out in nature, sometimes in very distant, hard-to-get-to places like the Great Salt Lake. Like many of us will never get to go and see that piece in person. We'll see it in documentation, like in the photographs. But then he also did some indoor sculpture. So he would bring dirt or rocks or residue from these sites and bring them indoors. And he called these site, non-site sculptures. The idea that it's most of his work was about being on site, being in that actual physical place. But here he was bringing documentation or artifacts from those places, bringing the dirt inside the gallery. But it loses its context, right? And we've talked about contextualization or recontextualization as being very important in art, that seeing something in a different context changes its meaning. Well, here, instead of this dirt being related to its region and to its natural environment, now it's taken out of context and it really loses that sense of specificity to its actual natural place. He often used mirrors to divide up, but also to kind of infinitely reflect these natural environments. So in a certain sense, they are very finite. They're condensed to this small amount, both spatially and in number of pieces or number of rocks in this case. But mirrors have this way of reflecting infinitely, right? So by spacing these mirrors out, it gives this sense of the infinite nature of the environment, or the infinite nature of nature at large. Just on a formal level as well, I think they do also make a dynamic form, right? The way that the mirrors in this case create this kind of geometric, almost star-like pattern across the circular orientation of the rocks. Another land artist, Michael Heiser, would say things like this. He said, "In the desert, I can find that kind of unraped, peaceful, religious space artists have always tried to put in their work." So in that way, he's trying to point that land art is not turning its back on the past, but this is a continuation that artists have often in the past dealt with religious and sacred subject matter, and that he feels he's trying to do the same thing. And then he says, "The position art as malleable barter exchange item falters as the cumulative economic structure gluts. The museum and collections are stuffed, the floors are sagging, but the real space still exists." And so here he's saying again that questioning, how many museums are we going to build? How many storage rooms are we going to build for art? There's so many collections that are just, sagging the floors. But we can go out into real space and create these real experiences for people. And he's also questioning in that first sentence the barter exchange idea. All of these artists, if you're making a huge land work, it's not something that you can buy and sell exactly, right? And so they're questioning whether art should be considered just a product, a consumer product that is for sale. And maybe it should be instead this experience. Maybe ownership needs to be re-examined. This is a really dynamic idea. I think it's attractive in many ways because in a certain sense it means art is for everyone. It's out in the landscape. You can go there and experience it for free, or for the cost of getting yourself there at least. On the other hand, it's very revolutionary, because how are artists going to maintain their lifestyles if they aren't able to make a living by selling their product? Hasn't art always been considered a product to sell, right? So kind of a fascinating new position, challenging the ideas of art as a product or a mercantile object. And this is an example of Michael Heiser's work. This is called Double Negative, where he displaced 240,000 tons of stone. He carved it out, or had it carved out here, creating this canyon and this other canyon that you see way in the back here. And then there's actually a naturally formed canyon that goes across in the opposite direction, forming something like an X. So here you can see where he dug out this piece and this piece, and then there's a natural canyon going across this direction. It's called Double Negative. Now this is incredibly hard to get to. You have to take fly, of course, first, depending on where you're starting from, but then helicopter into the terrain, or take hours and hours of bus rides and then traverse a lot of terrain. It's very difficult to get to. And so it almost becomes a pilgrimage. And that lines up with his idea of creating a kind of a sacred space that has been a part of art for generations. The idea of pilgrimage as a sort of a religious journey would also be appropriate here, that you have to make extraordinary effort to go and actually experience these sites for yourself. Here's that color image here. But you can imagine too, time of day would matter, would affect the formal qualities, the light and the shadow being cast. Season might affect it somewhat as well, or even just the weather. The color of the sky would give you a different aesthetic experience. Feeling dwarfed by this environment would be probably very humbling, but then also very beautiful and harmonizing. So land art and earthworks definitely inherit from minimalism. There's an emphasis on direct engagement with nature through materials and processes. It is multi-sensory, so it's not just something to see, but it's something you're going to feel viscerally in your body, around yourself, in the temperature and the air and the atmosphere. You're going to smell the earth around you. You might even touch the dirt. It tends to be site-specific, so you actually have to go to that site. It can't be moved to you. Or even if you were able to do the same exact work in a different environment, it would therefore be a different artwork. So imagine if Smithson did his spiral jetty in one of the Great Lakes in, Michigan, let's say, Lake Michigan, it would be a completely different project there than what it is in the Great Salt Lake in Utah. So it's site-specific. Several of the artists using that site, non-site idea of the indoor-outdoor kind of counterparts of their work. The idea of entropy, so letting the environment interact with the piece. And then the idea of leaving the museum or gallery, getting the viewer to go into a new space and have a different kind of experience. Richard Long is another earthwork artist who sometimes make pieces as ephemeral as this one, where he's just made lines in the grass by walking. So he'll walk a path back and forth over and over until the path is worn into the grass, and creates a very simple, again, sort of minimalistic composition here, just a simple X in the grass. So thinking about even tying in a little bit with pop art in the sense of breaking down the barrier between art and life, right? A simple walk could become an artwork. Or here again, walking a simple line. And noticing how your actions as a human affect the environment, and then also how the environment will affect your actions, right? So the next time it rains, or a week later when the grass grows, it'll overtake your marks on the landscape. And for Richard Long, also he would bring some of the nature back into the gallery. So these mud drawings on the wall, or these here, these sort of monumental in scale. Again, often using that monumentality to make us feel the size and the scope of Earth or of nature in comparison with the smallness and finite quality of humanity. Or here again by Richard Long. And then Andy Goldsworthy, who continues working to this day, sometimes doing more monumental and longer lasting pieces like this, where he's meticulously and carefully stacked these stones. And it's very fascinating. There's a great documentary movie about him that you could find probably even on YouTube and possibly on Netflix that shows his working process. And it can be quite tedious. I mean, as he's trying to balance these rocks, he doesn't know if the next rock might knock the balance completely out of whack. He doesn't use any kind of stabilizing or non-natural materials. So as he's stacking these rocks, they could potentially fall over and he has to start again, or he has to sort of jump out of the way before the rocks fall on him even. And he doesn't know how long it'll last until a tree branch falls on it, or the wind blows it over. Some of his projects, he does engage other workers to help him. So he has had other stone layers or other environmental kind of workers work with him in sculpting these tree branches as they undulate through the woods, up and down, meandering. And then again, this one that we saw earlier where he's organized these sticks over the lake, causing this, just beautiful reflection. So some of them might last an hour. Some of them might last weeks, possibly years, depending on the materials and the process that he has used. He says, when I'm working with materials, it's not just the leaf or the stone. It's the processes that are behind them that are important. That's what I'm trying to understand. Not a single isolated object, but nature as a whole. And he is very, very interested in how nature functions. He keeps a journal, and almost every day he'll write in the journal what he did that day. They tend to be kind of very brief, almost bullet note kind of sentences, like very brief descriptions of what happened, what the weather was like. And but over the years, he's learned so many really interesting facts. Like one year, he was trying to work with a certain kind of leaf and wasn't able to get it to work the way that he wanted it to. And the next year he was, and he realized that it was because of the amount of rainfall that year that had changed the leaf and made it a little bit more malleable instead of so fragile and brittle. And so he becomes very aware of the environment as a whole system, that everything affects the next thing. And then a few more ephemeral of his works. This one where he's just carved out snow. Or this one where he's taken individual naturally formed icicles and then married them together either through spit, wetting them and then being able to let them freeze together, holding them in place or propping them in ways that they get held in place. Transitory intervention. So sometimes works called environmental art might not be formed with all natural materials, but they're out in the natural environment and are sort of like an intervention in a short-term sense. So an example of this would be Christo and Jean-Claude, a married couple, who've done pieces like this out in Colorado. Now, the duration of the piece, it says 1970 to 72. It was not actually in place for 2 years, but the planning continued for 2 years, while the actual piece was only in place for about 2 days. They had 200,000 feet or more of woven nylon fabric that they placed in the middle of this valley, and it's simply called Valley Curtain. They put it in place, and it was meant to stay a couple of weeks, but then actually when it had only been up maybe 28 to 30 hours, there were such forceful winds that they actually had to begin removing it after just that approximately a day of being seen. So a very short-term project, however, really beautiful. And this kind of a work for Christo and Jean-Claude, it's completely formal. It's completely about the beauty of doing it. And it doesn't have an iconographic or a symbolic meaning. It doesn't have a social, like a social issue that it's connected to. It's really just about the beauty of seeing this huge orange shape, in the middle of the road, and then having it removed. And I think in a certain way, this piece is as potent after the fact as it is while it's up. I imagine that for anyone who drove down this stretch of highway often, once they saw it with this huge billowing orange kind of triangle filling up that valley, whenever they drove through that valley again, they saw that negative space in a different way than they did before, So even that negative space became a positive shape for a day while the sculpture was up, and then they became more aware of that space than they ever had before. Or this second one that we've seen before, Christo and Jean-Claude's running fence. I think it's interesting to note some of the details. So it's about 18 feet high, 24.5 miles long, but it crosses the private properties of 59 ranchers. And many of their pieces are like this, where they can't just erect it wherever they want to. They have to get local authority permission, right? They have to draw up blueprints and get permission from different authorities. In this case, from 59 different ranchers had to sign on to allow them to cross their property. They're always very environmentally sound and thoughtful, so they always leave their sites in the same or usually better condition than they first began, because they're usually picking up litter if that's a part of that environment, or in that space, or donating money to conservation funds for the land that they've used. So very conservationally or environmentally sound, but also it becomes this kind of a community project where they're working with local authorities and local landowners, etc., to make the project happen. This project was up for about 2 weeks. So again, just a short-term, beautiful, formal, kind of aesthetic experience where you see this beautiful contour line crossing and snaking back and forth across the landscape until it finally dove down into the ocean. Minimalism and land art often go hand in hand, and sometimes even in public works. So I just wanted to note for many of you that have possibly seen this work before, that Mylan's Vietnam Memorial wall in Washington, D.C. is a minimalist land art, essentially. She thought of it as cutting into the land, kind of scarring the land in the same way that the American kind of identity had been scarred by this really controversial and tragic war, right? And then it close up, the names engraved into it so that you can rub your hand across the wall and kind of feel the letters sunk into this black, this shiny, almost like a mirror, reflective black granite. And you walk along it so you really feel like you walk down into it, sort of descend into this, the scar, as she calls it, or wound, and then ascend it on the other side. Just summing up with the core issues, land art of the 60s and 70s is engaged specifically in natural materials and a natural landscape. But since the 1970s, land art or environmental art has also expanded to include incorporation of man-made materials in the natural environment. And a good example of that would be the Christo and Jean-Claude's projects. Skill and technique and craft can vary widely, so sometimes it is more intricate, like with Goldsworthy, weaving sticks and branches or balancing rocks very carefully. Other times it is the use of bulldozers to move dirt and rocks. Again, the artist may or may not physically create the work. The artist is foremost responsible for the concept or the artwork or the idea. They tend toward personal expression of the artist, but not always. And in terms of personal expression, it's not usually like an emotive or psychological expression, as in the case of AbX. Rather, it's a personal exploration of the relationship to the land or natural forces, or maybe more general spirituality, as in the case of Michael Heiser. And the artist's intent is to create a three-dimensional, visceral experience that engages the viewer visually as well as physically. So, challenges of land art or critique of land art. It's a really interesting question. How do you sell an artwork that is not a single portable work, like a painting or sculpture? Reliance on photographic or video documentation, so recognizing that the vast majority of people will never get to see these pieces in person, especially the ones that are farther removed or in rural locations. So is that fair? Is that a negative? Many earthworks are difficult to get to and will mostly be experienced through photographs or video. Does this make the work elitist? The forms in land art are often simple, like minimalism. So is land art too impersonal or unfeeling? And then given that land art came about during the turbulent 60s and 70s, is it escapist because it does not directly address culture and the wars of the time and the civil rights movement of the time? So these are all some different questions and or critiques of land art for us to consider. Head toward your online journal. Some handy sites. We've gone to the Art Story several times. They don't have as much about land art, but if you look up Robert Smithson in particular, as for this link there below, or look up minimalism, it also connects a bit with land art. You can also look up websites for the individual artists. That can be very handy. So there's an individual site for Robert Smithson. It's robertsmithson.com. Andy Goldsworthy, and then Christo and Jean-Claude actually have a very excellent website that explains each of their individual pieces and gives you a lot of detailed information about how they worked on past pieces, and then also kind of general frequently asked questions. So very handy site in both cases. All right, enjoy.